Hello, and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Today, I am going to be reading you a story from True Crimes Case History Volumes 1 to 3. And this story is going to be about Dr. John Schneeberger. Kipling, Saskatchewan is a tiny Canadian farming town. If you blinked while you were driving on Highway 48, you might just miss it. With only about 1,000 residents, life is slow and pretty much everyone in town knows one another. On Halloween night in 1992, a 23-year-old single mother named Candace was finishing her shift at the only convenience store in town. Candace had recently broken up with her boyfriend Danny. Danny had stopped by to see her at work, but they got into a heated argument that escalated until Candace eventually got so upset that she sped off in her car. Quote, "I was so mad at Danny I felt like killing him." Unquote. Candace couldn't think straight and decided to drive to the Kipling Memorial Hospital to visit her friend that worked there. She arrived to find that her friend wasn't working that night, but the nurses on duty could tell she was distraught and suggested she talk to the doctor. Dr. John Schneeberger was the doctor working the night shift. Dr. Schneeberger had moved to Canada from South Africa and was a well-respected member of the small community, even helping the town get a public swimming pool built. The residents of Kipling considered themselves lucky to have such an educated and skilled doctor living in their tiny town. Candace knew Dr. Schneeberger as well, as he had delivered her daughter earlier that year. Candace told Dr. Schneeberger about her anxiety, and he suggested a sedative and left the room. She was expecting him to offer a pill to calm her nerves, but she's surprised to see him return to the examination room with a syringe. Immediately after she received the shot, Candace recalls falling back on the table. Quote, "I fell over like a piece of jelly. I tried to scream as I fell over, but nothing would come out but a croaking noise." Unquote. Candace was partially unconscious, but still aware of what was going on. She could tell that someone was pulling down her jeans and laying her on her side facing the wall. She then realized someone was inside her. Completely under the effect of the sedative, she could do nothing. When Candace finally came to, she was too dizzy to drive home, so the nurses told her to stay the night in the hospital. The next morning, when she awoke, she knew something was wrong and confronted Dr. Schneeberger. She asked what was the drug that he gave her, and his response was, quote, "Why did you have crazy dreams?" Unquote. Candace knew she was raped. She asked the nurse for an airtight plastic bag and put her panties in it, then went home and immediately told her parents. Since this was an extremely small town with only one hospital, the next morning Candace drove to Regina, a slightly larger town about 95 miles away, to find a clinic that would perform a rape test. In the Regina clinic, Candace gave samples from her panties, her jeans, and they took a vaginal swab to test for semen. The results of the test were positive. Candace then knew without a doubt that her suspicions were correct, and that she had indeed been raped. She also asked for her blood to be tested. The results of the blood test showed that she had a drug called Versed in her system. Versed is a pre-anesthetic used to induce anesthesia and is used for procedures like colonoscopies. Candace went back to Kipling and filed a formal complaint with the Kipling Police Department. On November 2nd, Dr. Schneeberger volunteered to give a sample of his blood. He was adamant that he was innocent and that his blood DNA would not match the sample from Candace's rape kit. Blood was taken from the doctor's arm, and sure enough, he was correct. There was no match. After the DNA test was negative, Candace was still in disbelief. She spent the next year insisting to police that the DNA had been tampered with, but she had no way to prove it. Finally, after almost a year of pressure from Candace, in August 1993, Dr. Schneeberger agreed to a second voluntary DNA test. This time the test was done by a registered nurse and the procedures was monitored by police. They watched the needle enter his arm and the vials were taken directly to police headquarters. Again, the second test did not match the DNA sample from Candace's panties. Candace was devastated. After 2 failed DNA tests, residents of the small town of Kipling were not kind to Candace. Dr. Schneeberger was their hero. In such a small town, he was a godsend. They considered themselves lucky to have such a skilled doctor in their tiny town, whereas Candace was just a high school educated single mom. They rallied around the doctor and shunned Candace, believing that she was out for some sort of financial gain, or that she had a romantic interest in the doctor but wanted to harm him because she was being rejected. Residents were also suspicious of Candace because there were 2 nurses on shift that night of her alleged rape, but she said nothing to them. After the second DNA test, the more ridicule from the townspeople. Candace moved from Kipling to the city of Red Deer, Alberta, 9 hours away. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police closed the case in 1994. Dr. Schneeberger continued his practice and tried to get on with his life. In 1995, Candace was still reeling with disbelief that the DNA test didn't match. Out of ideas, she hired a private investigator named Larry O'Brien. O'Brien was a 25-year-old veteran of the RCMP who had done undercover and intelligence work in southern Ontario. Candace tasked him with obtaining yet another DNA sample, but in a more covert manner. On March 3, 1996, O'Brien broke into Dr. Schneeberger's car. Once inside his car, O'Brien collected a sample of hair from the headrest of the car. Unfortunately, there were no roots attached to the hair, so it had no usable DNA. He also found a lightly used tube of chapstick lip balm in the ashtray. On the chapstick would be epithelial cells that can be used for DNA testing. O'Brien took the chapstick and rubbed it onto the plastic of a window envelope. He then bagged, timed, and initialed the sample and sent it to an independent forensic lab in British Columbia. When the results came back, Candace was ecstatic. The DNA sample from the chapstick matched the DNA from her panties. She was right all along. Armed with this new DNA evidence, Candace returned to Kipling and demanded that the police reopen the case. Since this DNA sample was obtained without a warrant, the police couldn't use it as evidence. Also, there was no guarantee that the DNA from the chapstick was actually Dr. Schneeberger's, so police did not reopen the case. Police did, however, have their curiosities, but were apprehensive to officially charge him. Officers believed in the science of the DNA. Candace was still completely baffled as to why the DNA from his arm did not match the DNA from the panties and lip balm. So she filed a civil suit against Dr. Schneeberger and brought charges against him with the medical society. Again, with all the additional pressure, Dr. Schneeberger volunteered to have his blood taken a 3rd time for another DNA test. This time, to ensure the integrity of the test, the procedure was performed in the police forensic lab and recorded on video. Not much blood needed for a DNA test, so it's common for a sample to be taken from a simple pinprick on the finger. But Dr. Schneeberger claimed he has a condition that causes him to bruise easily on his hands. He requested the sample be taken from his left arm. Since this was a voluntary test and he was giving the sample in good faith, police complied with his request. On November 20th, 1996, police again videotaped the blood being drawn from Dr. Schneeberger's arm, and the blood was taken inside a police lab. There were problems extracting the doctor's blood. However, technician Jean Rooney recalled, quote, "The vein appeared larger than I would have expected, and I thought that was a little unusual," unquote. Sometimes when extracting blood from a patient, there can be a bad vacuum in the vein, which can cause the inability to get the blood out. Eventually, she was able to get a sample of the blood, but she noticed something strange. Quote, "It's a little strange in that the blood doesn't look really fresh." Unquote. The lab attempted to test the blood anyway, but they eventually determined that it wasn't a large enough sample and the blood had been too degraded for an accurate DNA test. Yet again, Candace was furious. Quote, "Oh my God, this is bullshit." Unquote. Quote, "That's our last chance to get blood from him, and you guys screwed it up." Unquote. However, just 5 months later, Candace would finally get a break, but that break would come at a great cost. On the evening of April 25th, 1997, just as police were about to ask for yet a fourth DNA test, Dr. Schneeberger's wife Lisa contacted police and accused her husband of raping her 13-year-old daughter, his stepdaughter. The young girl had come to her mother with the information and a condom wrapper that was left in her bed. The young girl said her stepfather, Dr. Schneeberger, had been coming into her room in the middle of the night for years and inject her with something that would leave her with fleeting memories of sexual incidents with the doctor. Lisa searched her husband's home office and found a box of condoms, syringes, and drugs including Versed and immediately called police. Dr. Schneeberger was immediately arrested and ordered under a warrant to do a fourth DNA test. Since this test was no longer voluntary, the technician took 3 samples. The samples were taken from his hair, a saliva swab from his mouth, and a blood sample from his finger on his right hand, not the left arm, where all 3 of the previous tests had been taken. All 3 samples matched the DNA from the chapstick and from the semen on Candace's panties. Dr. John Schneeberger was officially charged with aggravated assault, maximum penalty of life in prison, 2 counts of administering a noxious substance to commit an indictable offense with a maximum penalty of life in prison, 1 count of obstruction of justice with a max penalty of 10 years, and 1 count of sexual assault with a max penalty of 10 years. It wasn't until the trial in November 1999 before the world found out how Dr. Schneeberger had thwarted police for 7 years. The nurses and technician had seen the needle physically go into his arm each time, so how did the DNA come up different? Dr. Schneeberger took the witness stand in his own defense and said that the first 3 times they drew blood, they were drawing someone else's blood. He had taken another of his male client's blood, inserted it into a thin rubber tube called a Penrose drain, along with an anticoagulant to keep it in liquid state, and implanted the tube into his own arm just next to his own vein. This is why he also insisted on having the blood taken from his left arm. In fact, during one of the videotapes, you can see that he wears a long-sleeve shirt and does not pull it up far enough to see the incision in his arm, and for a split second, you can see the tube protruding from his arm. This also explains why, on the 3rd blood sample, the technician thought the blood looked dark and not fresh. He had removed the tube from his arm after the 2nd test, stored it in a refrigerator, then replaced it into his arm 4 years later for the 3rd DNA test. However, even after all that, Dr. Schneeberger still claimed that none of what Candace said was true. His excuse was that he put the tube of blood into his own arm because it was the only way to defend himself, and he didn't trust the police. He claimed that Candace must have broken into his house and stolen a used condom from his trash in order to get the semen sample and frame him. In reference to his defense, Judge Ellen Gunn said it was, quote, inventive, fanciful, imaginative. However, one that does not apply is credible, and called his theory preposterous, unquote. Of course, that defense was not near enough to convince a jury. He was convicted of 2 counts of sexual assault, 1 account of administering a noxious substance to commit an indictable offense, and 1 count of obstructing justice. Amazingly, Dr. Schneeberger was sentenced to only 6 years in a minimum security prison. During Dr. Schneeberger's stay in prison, Lisa Schneeberger divorced him and fought with the legal system for the right to not allow his access to her daughters. For Lisa Schneeberger, her agony was just getting started. When John was arrested, she had 4 children to support, one of which was only 13 months old. She sold the house and car in order to pay the bills, filed for divorce, and took back her maiden name of Dillman. On the evening before the guilty verdict was given, Lisa refused to let the girls sleep over with him, as was required by the visitation agreement, and she was ordered to pay a $2,000 fine for contempt in court. While in jail, John insisted on visitation rights, but Lisa kept fighting. Despite her attempts to pursue judges and politicians, the court ordered her to force the girls to visit him once a month, a man that repeatedly drugged and raped their half-sister. When the day finally came of the first forced visitation at the Bowdoin institution where he was being held, about 100 protesters showed up at the gates to the prison and refused to let the car pass into the prison. The protesters were organized by Mad Mothers Against Pedophiles and claim the courts are putting sex offenders' rights ahead of children's best interests. However, police eventually forced the crowds back, and the car carrying the girls entered the prison. Upon entering the prison, the girls, aged 5 and 6, were both scared to death, crying and clinging to their mother's leg. A social worker eventually came to the rescue and called visitation off. The win, however, was short-lived. Lisa eventually had to bring the girls to see their father on the last Sunday of every month. Eventually, after realizing the girls had no interest in visiting him, he dropped his visitation requests. In 2002, Bob Mills, a member of Canadian Parliament, lobbied for a bill called Lisa's Law. It was an amendment to the Divorce Act to limit the rights of a child's access to sex offenders, but this bill did not pass. During the following months, Lisa continued to fight her now ex-husband. She made sure the Canadian Immigration Department realized that he had lied when he applied for citizenship by concealing information, his crimes, and making false representations. Schneeberger served only 4 of his 6-year sentence, much of it spent in Ferndale Prison in British Columbia, often referred to as, quote, Club Fred, unquote. Ferndale is a minimum security prison with residential-style housing, plenty of open spaces, and even a 9-hole golf course. Schneeberger was stripped of his medical license and his Canadian citizenship and deported back to South Africa. He reportedly lives with his mother in Durban and works for a catering business. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking to my channel, and I will see you on the next one.